Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to take you behind the scenes into my process on how I edit a series of photos. These are the techniques that I use for my work every day, for my architecture and landscape work, and I thought it would be fun to revisit old photos that I otherwise would have abandoned long ago were it not for the fact that I was digging through some archives and I just rediscovered them, and see if I can apply what I've learned in the last couple of years to photos that when I took them, they were just underwhelming for me for one reason or another, or maybe I just forgot it because when I go on these trips, I tend to take thousands of photos and don't tend to remember them. I lose track of what I've taken, to be honest. So this photo in particular, I took on a trip to Iceland like 4 or 5 years ago, and it was one of thousands of photos that I must have taken that trip. I honestly haven't even seen it since then. I'm sure that when I took it, I was like, it's okay, and didn't think much of it. I didn't see the potential in it, but I do now, and I think I can do something really cool. Actually, I already did. If you've seen my Instagram, you've probably seen it, but this is going to go more into detail, and I've got some other photos that I'm going to show you. And the cool thing is that it doesn't really take much. You're going to see that when I go into Photoshop, I'm not stacking, a shit ton of layers. We're not doing too much work. We're just making some simple, practical adjustments that go a long way into turning a photo into something cool. So right off the bat, obviously this photo is overexposed in the highlights. It's a very high contrast scene. The sun is in the frame, and it's going to be impossible to expose this, to keep all the detail in the highlights, in the shadows. I took this photo on my Samsung NX1 back when I shot with Samsung. I was fully invested in that ecosystem, and then Samsung really kind of screwed me over because they left the camera industry entirely and left all of us who had invested in their system kind of just hanging. The value of all my stuff just tanked overnight, so I still have a grudge against Samsung, but the NX1 was a camera that was just ahead of its time, I guess. It was an awesome camera for what it was at the time, but I guess the world just wasn't ready for it. So what do we have here? Again, overexposed highlights. Colors are a little bit muted. Composition works. We've got some interesting elements, some humans in the foreground, adding a sense of scale to the entire scene. Using Capture One, we did shoot raw, so we're gonna do a lot with it. We can recover the highlights, as you've seen here. I don't normally do highlight recovery all the way down, but in this case, it was kind of necessary. And I also brought the midtones down by using the brightness slider. And the brightness slider is a very powerful tool because colors and tonality, they live in the midtones, and when you bring those down, that's when I feel that you see the rich colors in an image. And the brightness slider is great for that because it does it without distorting the highlights or the shadows. You can look at my histogram and see that as I bring it up, the highlights are still there, nothing is clipping, and as I bring it down, nothing is crushing in the shadows. So I tend to bring my highlights down a bit, and let's see, I recovered the shadows a little bit because I don't want the dark areas to go too dark, but I just want the midtones to have a nice rich color saturation. Honestly, this is a much more, I think, effective way of adding saturation to your image than just bringing up the saturation. I actually brought down the saturation a little bit for this image because I thought it was too much. And the blues, I just shifted them towards more of a cyanish kind of look. I don't tend to like purplish blues. I like my blues personally to be a little bit greener, a little bit mintier. And that's really all we did here. And look, this photo is fine. I added some clarity, I added some structure, posted on Instagram, and nobody would be offended. It's a good photo, but it can be so much more. So let's take this. And so the first thing we're going to do in this image is let's break down what it needs. So we have a blank layer, and obviously we have our sun. It's the brightest thing in the image, it's the brightest thing in the solar system, and It is in the shot, it is at an angle, and it is affecting the lighting all around us. There is a lot of texture in the lighting. There's a lot of contrast because it's backlit. And we have our mountains. Well, actually, this is a glacier to be exact. And it's pretty cool, but I think it's a little small in the image. The humans add a sense of scale, but I think we can make this look a lot better. So let's get rid of that. And the first thing I'm going to do here, I'll do this on this image. This is a trick that I often use when I want things to stand out a little bit more, is I make a selection about halfway across the image. We're going to use our transform tool, and we're just going to increase the height just a little bit. You don't want to go too far because the humans then are going to look wonky and it's going to look crazy. And then we're going to do it again. This time the humans will not be in the selection, and we're just going to focus on the peaks. And this is just making the glacier in the background gradually a little bit bigger, a little bit more imposing. It's a trick I use often when I want buildings to look just a little bit bigger. You don't want to go too far, you just want to be a little deceptive, but like everything else I'm going to show you, tact is key. You want to be subtle, because otherwise things go too far, and that's when things look terrible. So we can also go into our Liquify filter in Photoshop, and we can make some minor adjustments. Let me make sure the humans are not in the shot, in the selection. And what we're doing here is just making this a little bit bigger. Again, just being subtle, and a little subtlety goes a long way. If I wanted to, I could probably keep the humans a little bit smaller, but I think this looks good. Anyway, we merge our image because we don't need that anymore, and that's where we're at here. You can see I already did this edit, so I don't feel a need to do it from scratch, but I will show you a couple things from time to time. And we're starting off with a little bit of contrast reduction. And this whole image is going to be a very airy, bright, in spots kind of image. I want the horizon to look like there's a lot of haze coming from the sun. I want the contrast levels to be lower towards the middle of the frame and then higher towards the edges to add a little bit of dimension. And this is how you add like a light, airy haze to the image. And also in nature and in life, things that are furthest from you have less contrast to your eye. So it wouldn't make sense for the stuff in the background to have as much contrast as the stuff in the foreground. That's just not how our eyes perceive the lighting in the world. So to start, we added a mask because I don't want that effect everywhere. And we're gonna go again. It lifted the levels also on the people. You can actually see the blue in this guy's sweater a little bit more. Before it was black, and that's okay. I like it. And the next thing we're gonna do is, you can see I added some haze to the glacier, a little bit of warmth too. You can see it was very cold, very muted, and I did that by doing a solid color layer. And I picked a relatively warm color, not too bright, not too saturated. Changed the blend mode to soft light and made a mask because I don't want the image, the effect affecting the whole image. This is what it would look like without the mask. And at 100%, you can see now we just have a bright image. I don't like that. I don't like uniform adjustments like that unless, you know, in rare occasions. So we have a little bit more haze in the background, and I probably actually went a little bit too far. I could probably take this effect out of certain spots. Oops, that's too much. Let's reduce our brush to 20% and actually bring some of that back, 10%. And yeah, that's a little bit softer of an edge. And then we go into the meat of our transformation, the sky replacement. The sky replacement. The one element in a composite that could really sell it and make it look amazing, or it can completely make it look like trash, and that is up to you on how you want to go about it. there are a million ways in Photoshop to replace a sky. For a long time, I did manual replacements with channels masking, blend if options, sometimes the old-fashioned way with the pen tool, and you just cut out the horizon and you feather the hell out of it and you make micro adjustments. It was very time consuming. Photoshop has a new AI sky replacement feature that I am ashamed to admit actually works pretty well. Not all the time, but even when it doesn't work perfectly, it can still get you 90% of the way there. This is the mask that Photoshop's algorithm made on its own, and it's actually pretty good. It's pretty gradual. It's very well blended, but it's not perfect. There are still adjustments you need to make because more importantly than the mask in a sky replacement is the consistency in the lighting and the color from the background, the composite layer, to the foreground, the original layer. So you have to make sure that the sky tonality and exposure matches what's in the foreground, and you can't go too crazy with the change. You have to make it look like it was part of the scene. So when we did this sky replacement, here's the original image. The sun is, well, it's there in the image. Let's bring that a little brighter. That's the sun. So the sun should not magically be over here or over here, because then the lighting, the shadows in the foreground would not make sense, and that's when people know that something is off. That is what reveals it to be a fake. So we don't want that. We want our lighting placement to be consistent because the light should be coming from over here. That's why we have these shadows on the rocks and here on the cliffs. And this sky replacement does that to an extent. I know we cheated a little bit because the sun was over here and now it's closer to the horizon, but as long as the adjustments that we make as far as the direction of the lighting are consistent with what's already in the scene, we can cheat it a little bit. And more importantly was just creating the exposure to match the foreground, because without it, this looks a little fake. I mean, it's a good sky replacement. I think the sky works, but I mean, the sky is obviously not that dark in the original image, and it should be the brightest thing in the image, but here the foreground is almost as bright as the sky, so I think it looks fake. So what I did was I added some luminance to the sky itself. I made it a little bit fluffier, a little bit airier, and now it kind of looks like part of the scene. I think it looks like the sky is lighting the foreground, and we're gonna fix the exposure issues in the foreground. I think they're too hot. I think the whole image is a little too hot, but we're gonna chip away and add some depth to it. And how we're gonna do that is, you guessed it, another solid color layer, but this time we're adding a little bit more of a muted warmth color, and we're using the color blend mode. And what this is doing is just adding a uniform color palette to the scene to kind of sell the effect of the sky replacement a little bit more, harmonize the colors. You see that my opacity is like at 10%. It's not very strong. If it was at full opacity, this is what it would look like. Obviously that looks terrible. And if you wanted to go a little bit further and refine it, you can go into the blend if tool by just double clicking on the layer. And you see this underlying layer slider here. Look what it does. It removes the effect from the shadows. Now, I want it in the shadows, but maybe not that much. So what I could do is I could split the difference. I can hold the Option key and just drag half of the slider out, and you can see that it reduces... Oh, I didn't grab it. Let's try that again. There we go. You can see that it reduces part of the effect on the shadows. So you can see the shadows in the rocks are still a little bit more blue. So it subtly reduces the effect. In this case, I'm okay with it affecting the whole image, but maybe we can split the difference looking back on it now. And these are, again, subtle adjustments. Maybe to you it doesn't look any different, but to me it makes a world of difference. And actually I kind of liked it better looking at those shadows. I liked it when it affected the whole image. And it should make sense because look, the sky is reflecting, the light is reflecting off of the foliage here. So it should make sense that the light hitting these rocks, bouncing back into it, should be a little bit warmer. Maybe on the glaciers it should be a little bit cooler, and maybe I'll just make that adjustment. Set the brush to 20% and just add a little bit of blue back into the edges of the glacier there. But this is all up to taste. This is all, just how your eye sees it. The important thing is just to keep the colors and the exposure consistent with what your eye would naturally see in the natural world with this scene, while still making it, a little bit extra. So the thing we're going to do now is we're going to cheat, and we're going to use a plugin called Luminar. And here I added a lot of glow to the highlights using their glow feature. And what this did was just soften the highlights, reduce that digital edge that makes these digital images a little bit too jagged at times, and just kind of added some cream to the overall image. It didn't remove the detail. There's still plenty of detail in the shot, but it just kind of nerfed that sharpness a little bit. Not too much. And I used the mask. Without the mask, it's everywhere. And again, the image is just too bright universally, so I didn't want that. Actually, could probably take it out of the foreground just a little bit more as well. Looking back now, probably should have done that in the original, but we can do that now. We can fix it, and that's just kind of removing it from the foreground, because obviously I want the person's eye who's looking at this image. I want your eyes at the center of the frame where the people are. It's okay if you occasionally look at the foliage, but it shouldn't be where your eye goes to automatically. So anything I can do to divert your attention to the center of the frame, that's what I will do. This is where I want you looking, nowhere else. And so Luminar is an interesting plugin. It's an AI supported plugin, and it can look crazy at times if you don't restrain it. If you let the AI do its thing, it's going to look terrible in my opinion, but it is a very powerful plugin if you use it with restraint. So I'm just going to go into that plugin really quick. Plugins, where'd it go? There you go. Filter, Luminar Ai. And I've removed the effects. I don't remember exactly what my settings were when I did this, but I'm going to try to recreate it. Again, it's very simple. Even though this piece of software is very sophisticated and it does have quite an abundance of tools to use. It has a bunch of presets, but I don't use those because they're trash. But if you just go down here to this glow slider, I'm going to use the Ordin effect, and I'm just going to bring that up. Look at what it does to our highlights. It just adds like a little bit of softness and glow to the entire scene, but we're going to refine it a little bit. I'm going to bring up the softness, and let's see. There's other things you can do. There's Ordin and Soft. Actually, I think this is the one I probably used, was the Ordin Effect Soft. Let me see. Was it Glow? No. Maybe. Let's see. Oh, it's not letting me affect it, but it was not Soft Focus. Honestly, any of these effects would have worked, but I think we were probably using just a regular glow effect. Yeah, whatever. Close enough. So you can see that we're not going all the way. We're not dragging this all the way up, because that would be crazy and, unrealistic. So we're just kind of keeping it within a realm of restraint. And I think that's the only effect that I made. Maybe I added some detail, but I can't remember, honestly. I think this is the only thing I did this time around in Luminar. We're just going to cancel this and delete this layer because we don't need it. This is our Luminar effect, and we're going to take an overlay, blended solid color layer. So once again, solid color layer, muted warm color, and this time set to overlay. And this is just going to add some punch to our highlights a little bit, to certain parts of the scene. Again, I did a mask. I'm not making this a universal a universal update. No, not even update, effect. This is not a universal effect. And you can see I have the blend if layer. I did that little trick. I took it away from the shadows because I didn't want the shadows being affected too much. And without that, you can see that it lifts our shadows all the way. I did not want that. I just wanted it in closer to the highlights, so that's the effect we're going for. And honestly, I could probably take it a little further looking at it now. So you can see that it mostly affects the hottest parts of the image, but also brings up some of the foliage just a little bit hotter, which is natural because that foliage is very reflective and it's getting directly hit by the sun, so it would have a little bit of punch to it. But honestly, I think it could probably use a little less, so let's go to 30% and let's take that down just a hair. And finally, we have our grade that I use a plugin called Exposure made by Alien Skin for. And you can see that it brought everything back down because, again, when you want something to look a little bit cinematic, it has to be, in my opinion, below a certain exposure level. And I used, well, let's just go into the plugin so I can show you what I did. Now, this might be cheating a little bit, but I honestly think that these film emulations in Alien Skin are some of the best. So while I could do this manually, I prefer not to if I can save myself some time. And I think the overall intensity for I stacked two filters here. One is at 70%, one is at 30%. And the one that I use at 70%, it's the dominant one. I believe it's the Kodachrome 35 faded, bright and creamy. There you go. Obviously that's too much, so we lowered that to 70%. And then I used another one called Saturated Glow. And look at the highlights. It just gives more of a nice glow to the highlights. And this is what our Kodachrome layer is doing. It just brings the midtones down, adds a little bit of warmth to the image. We're going to discard these changes because I already did this. And also, again, I masked it away from some of the edges just because I didn't like what it was doing to the blues in the corner. I think it muted them a little bit too much. I kind of wanted to keep some of them there. And finally, I guess the cherry on top that brings everything together is a vignette. And you can see here that without it, our eye is, well, I mean, we've been kind of progressively stacking the exposures, layering them. So there is more luminance towards the center of the frame, but this just kind of punctuates that effect a little bit. The way I do my vignettes is I bring down the highlights and the curves, a little bit of the higher midtones, and then I bring back the shadows because I don't want the shadows to be crushed with my vignettes. I want the details to still be there. And I think this is how you should do a vignette. It's just my opinion. And again, we masked it. We don't want it affecting the brightest part of our image, but everything else can gradually go dark because we want our eyes on our humans. And that is pretty much it. This is where we started, and this is where we're at. And that's not the end. I also made some final adjustments in Capture One. So we're gonna go to our Iceland Final Tips folder, and you'll see here that I just did a couple more things. I added another vignette, same exact vignette as I did in the previous Photoshop layer, but I made the adjustments with the brightness, and again I brought up the shadows and the blacks a little bit because I didn't want to lose the detail there, but I just wanted a more gradual, progressive progression to dark and the edges. And I added a slight color grade, more like a color fix. I brought down the mids just a little bit, raised the shadows, and just dropped a hint of blue into the shadows. I thought they were looking a little bit too purple, so we brought it more towards a cyanish. I'm not going for a crazy teal and orange, lut bitch kind of color grade here. This is just a subtle reduction in warmth in the shadows, and that is it. That is our final image. We have come a very long way from where we started over here, and that is the first image in this video. We will go on to the second one now.